Welcome to Mandates and Megaphones, hosted by Jeremy Maggs, unpacking the politics, promises and power plays behind the G20 summit.
Hello and a warm welcome to Mandates and Megaphones in association with Standard Bank. It's the podcast where diplomacy meets disruption, where geopolitical choreography is colliding with economic ambition, and where emerging powers are demanding more than just a seat at the table. I'm Jeremy Maggs. Now, as South Africa counts down to hosting the G20 summit at the end of the year, and Brics continues its quiet, deliberate expansion, there is an important new question on the global agenda. Can the global south truly reshape the geopolitical order, or is this just an updated version of an old power play? The idea of multipolarity, once a theory, is now becoming a policy imperative, and nowhere is this more apparent than in the growing strategic convergence between Brics and the G20. But does the overlap mean influence or confusion? Well, I want to try and take you through all of this with Ashraf Patel, Senior Research Associate at the Institute for Global Dialogue at UNISA. So, Ashraf, a very warm welcome. And let's start with this. If I understand this correctly, you are suggesting that Brics and the G20 are at something of a pivotal convergence point. Are there specific geopolitical signals that tell you this is something bigger, more important, and not just symbolic?
Thanks for having me on your good show, Jeremy. Yes, there is a kind of pivotal convergence that's not just symbolic, and these are driven by deep structural forces. Trump 2.0 is now a movement, not just a moment. And this signals the return to economic nationalism. And that is at odds with the globalization narrative of the last 3 or 4 decades. And I think that is the big driver, because both the emerging Brics bloc as well as the G20 array of nations are still deeply committed to globalization, which has relatively been successful over the last 3 decades. And I think this is where the convergence is coming in.
But difficult at this point to reconcile those two, some would say even immovable forces.
Definitely. You know, the power of the nation state, as well as the emergence of global governance post-World War II, has always had some sort of tension. But the last decade, with the rise of Trump, economic nationalism, Brexit, the move towards regional blocs, as well as identity politics at the nation-state level in the US, Europe, countries like India, Turkey, these kind of identity politics is at divergence with the kind of values and free flow of people, goods and capital of globalization. And I think it was the COVID crisis that actually exposed the weaknesses of globalization, both people to people, as well as supply chains. And I think that has reorientated new kinds of movements or policies around back to basics, industrial, economic policies.
And Ashraf Patel, if we were having this conversation maybe straight after COVID 5 years or so, we might have said maybe this is a little bit of strategic branding. But this economic nationalism that you're talking about now seems to me to be an entrenched or an entrenching actual power shift.
Definitely. I think especially in the core in the US has been the significant power globally, but it's now kind of being challenged by both the East and the South. And the rise of China has been the narrative and the reality of the last decade. And that has rattled both the US as well as the EU. And so what has happened essentially, economic nationalism is a response to two very powerful forces. The first is unfettered globalization has meant that American workers, especially in the Rust Belt states, which constitutes the core of the Trump or MAGA base, they have been kind of isolated and have lost out in the globalization story, as well as working classes across the global south. And therefore, you're finding a return to economic nationalism, towards industrialization, as well as localization in the economic sphere. But more concerning is the return to identity politics, race-based politics in the US and now in Europe. And that is an entrenched trend. It's not just symbolic. It is now entrenched in the political economy of both the EU and the US.
So let's talk about practicality and consequence then. If we're seeing this shift and maybe a growing alliance between Brics and certain members within the G20, it's going to say a lot surely about future voting blocs and decision-making power.
Absolutely. Look, there's a deepening of global governance. Let's start with the apex institutions. Both the IMF and World Bank constitutes the G7 as well as the Brics core. The Brics core share of IMF quotas, voting rights is increasing, and with that comes the demand for more decision-making powers across the IMF and the World Bank. And a good example is special drawing rights as a mechanism. Many global South nations want to use these special drawing rights for their own currency and their own trade financing, etc., etc. And I think that is the big story around new kinds of reforms around global governance. We should also be mindful that China is now one of the largest provider of global public goods, whether it's funding UN or international aid through the BRI initiatives, etc., etc. So there is a kind of multipolarity already happening in real time.
So you talk about the influence of China, the expansion of Brics. What does this mean then in terms of strengthening its hand at the upcoming G20 negotiations?
I would say, given the veracity and scale of disruption of Trump 2.0, the tariffs are kicking in. South Africa faces headwinds, very cold economic headwinds with the tariffs, and many other nations, Canada, Mexico, etc. So I would imagine, and I'm quite certain, if we were to forecast, I would see a closer convergence between all nation states within the G20, both the Brics core as well as the G7 core, except the US, on the key agenda items. And first, that would be to save multilateralism, especially the core institutions, i.e. the UN, the World Health Organization for pandemic preparedness, as well as the World Trade Organization. All of them, both the EU and Brics nations, are committed to making the WTO work, but a new kind of model and new mechanisms to ensure that the WTO serves all nations. And then, very importantly, IFI reform, International Financial Institution reform. All the nations are committed, but the modalities and the priorities are quite different. And I think that is where the nuance comes in.
But risky, I would imagine, to have an aggrieved or intransigent United States of America outside of that tent.
Definitely. The current US administration, and I would imagine future administrations, are very concerned. They do not want to commit to global public goods. They do not want to commit to losing the kind of hegemony of the dollar as a reserve currency. That is the strategic kind of resource in world trade today. And any kind of move, i.e. de-dollarization, or making the US pay wealth taxes, etc., they're kind of going to resist it. And that's the reason the US Treasury Secretary has not attended any G20 finance ministers meeting. And it does seem that Trump himself would not attend the G20 summit because they do not want to commit to the communique that talks about debt relief or wealth taxes, etc., etc. So they are definitely digging their heels around their own, putting the American economic interests first.
But you can't, the world can't bypass America. It still remains very significant whether Trump is there or not.
Definitely, definitely. Look, the dollar is a reserve currency, as well as the scale and scope of US industries and multinational corporations. But there is a relative decline in US share of global trade in goods. But remember, the US has also been dominant in services, in technology. But even that edge is now being challenged by China, for instance. So China has moved quite rapidly in the services industry, whether it's 5G, whether it's AI, etc. You're beginning to see new models emerging, even around services in tech. And that was the hegemony of the US. So we are beginning to see on all its core strategic advantages, Brics nations and China in particular have made significant gains in those areas. And that's the reason you get a very vociferal response by the Trump administration, because they feel the Chinese are encroaching very, very fast with a similar level of quality in technology and services. And I think they're very concerned about that because it does kind of erode their national strategic advantage and national interest.
So within that expanding BRICS orbit, as we've discussed, where does this leave South Africa?
Well, South Africa is in a very precarious situation for several reasons. One is, of the BRICS core, we're the smallest economy. We're only 1/5 of the size of Brazil, for instance. And so we do not have convening economic power. And therefore, we rely on BRICS nations to kind of cushion us in the global economy. But even there, what we're beginning to see within BRICS itself, as is the G20, all the nations are kind of putting their national interests first because they're concerned about their own industries and jobs and exports. And I think national interests will always trump regional blocs. And in that situation, South Africa is very vulnerable at this point in time. Perhaps we could strengthen our partnerships with other nations, be it Mexico, India, Indonesia, and other nations that are undergoing tariff reviews. But at this point in time, we should be try and balance, keep on good terms with all the blocs, but also be realistic that at this point, the Trump administration is not interested in any concessions for nations like South Africa and others.
Just a reminder, you're listening to Mandates and Megaphones here on Moneyweb in association with Standard Bank, and I'm in conversation with Ashraf Patel, a senior research associate at the Institute for Global Dialogue at UNISA. Ashraf, let's continue the conversation. Do you think then that the G20 in its current structure is capable of absorbing the shift that you've been talking about without damaging or fracturing east-west polarity, which is tenuous to say the least right now?
Overall, Jeremy, yes. The G20 with all the nations, both the G7 core, except the US, as well as the BRICS core, first and foremost, they all committed to saving multilateralism. I think they are coherent and committed to that. Secondly, they have realized that all of the G20 and the global south and the world will lose if there is another global financial crisis. So they will cohere and ensure that they do everything possible to kind of save a future financial crisis because it's too costly for everyone. And then thirdly, they are committed to reforming important global institutions, particularly the WTO. And I think the WTO, because trade and tariffs are front and center of the current geopolitics in Trump 2.0, the G20 nations have realized that we need a new kind of WTO, a remodeled WTO, a new system of trade, better mechanisms such as the appellate body to work and function. And we definitely need to accommodate the aspirations of the global south, who need a fair trade system in order to come out of poverty. Because if you do not have a functional WTO, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people could falter back into poverty. And I think that is the risk that they face. And I think on that basis alone, the G20 BRICS, G7 core will somehow agree on some kind of consensus. It may not be ideal for all of them, but they will try and save multilateral institutions.
What would be an ideal consensus?
An ideal consensus could be the following. The first would be a consensus on international financial institutions, IFI reforms, but very clear reforms with clear guidelines and clear commitments. The second could be a very clear agreement on the WTO linked to the UN Summit of the Future. The Pact of the Future is quite detailed in the major issues of multilateral institutions, as well as refinancing the World Health Organization after the US pullout, especially around pandemic preparedness. I think that is a very key agreement. And in my view, the fourth would definitely be a consensus on climate finance and the loss and damage funds, who bears the burden of climate finance, and how do you recalibrate responsibilities around climate finance, etc.
Ashraf Patel, you talk about the G7 at the core of the G20. Do you think, though, that the G7 is maybe losing a degree of dominance given the ascendancy, as you've outlined to me, of the G20 nations?
It's an interesting discussion. Remember, the kind of unipolar world is kind of declining as you get the rise of multipolarity. And for two reasons. One is the G7 used to be the apex hegemonic institution for several decades. But with the rapid rise of China in particular and the Brics bloc, it is being challenged. It is still very significant purely because of the capital holdings, the number of multinational corporations in the G7 nations, the UN Security Council makeup, etc., as well as the scale and scope of the higher education system. They still have the edge over the developing South. But I think the intensity and the rise of China in the last decade has rattled the G7, and therefore the response of Trump 2.0. But it is beginning to kind of adapt a bit slowly, though. The reality is slowly kicking in, and one can see that quite concretely with a more independent European Union foreign policy. I mean, just last week, the EU and China agreed on a common consensus on climate change. That's quite significant. And one can see that, yes, overall, with multipolarity, the influence of the G7 is in a slow decline as the rise of multipolarity comes through. But it's all going to be around the strength of partnerships going forward. And that's going to determine whether it's going to be relevant or be absorbed into the G20.
So what type of partnerships would the G7 want to forge, do you think, going ahead?
Well, I would say the G7 as well as the EU are beginning to look very seriously at partnerships with the global South, be it with the ASEAN group in Asia or the EU-Africa partnerships. We've recently saw the EU-Mercosur partnership with Latin America that was quite interesting, although there was a backlash from the farmers and the workers. So you are going to get backlash if deals are kind of too concentrated in favor of large corporations. And I think citizens, smaller groups like small and medium enterprises, small-scale farmers, women-owned enterprises, they would want to definitely play a more important role in global governance. But the G7 is diversifying its partnerships. The EU in particular is diversifying their partnerships. They no more kind of have that strategic relationship with the US. And you're beginning to see the one example is the EU and NATO have committed all nation states to spend 5% of their GDP on defense. Now, that is a signal that they want to take a more independent role, but it also has negative consequences for the developing world in a sense that there'll be less resources for development in the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So I think whatever strategic decisions the G7 or G20 make, or the EU, they need to really be cognizant of the burden of development of the UN SDGs.
It's interesting, you talk about the courtship as far as the global South is concerned, but I can't help but wonder whether this is a genuine values realignment within the global south that's got to be undertaken? Or do you think a lot of it is still going to hinge on transactional geopolitics and back to your argument of economic nationalism?
Jeremy, it's definitely national interest. It's core economic nationalism. If you were to just look at the narrative and the rhetoric of, let's say, the EU just energy transition and the COP processes and decarbonization, that is the signature project of the EU and G7. But when you unpack today, most of the EU multinational oil companies from BP, Shell, Oil, Eni, Total, their explorations of oil and gas in Africa is at an all-time high, higher than in the 80s, actually. So what we're beginning to see is they're putting their core energy interests first, and they want access to those resources first. And I think that signals that it's still purely transactional, purely national interest. And I think in that context, African blocs, the AU, South Africa, Brics, we need to be also sober to that reality that most of the North, as well as Southern powers, when they engage Africa and South Africa, they still engage us with their core national interest first and not necessarily our interest.
We are in an era, I'd suggest to you, of weaving, of ducking, of diving and dancing. And there is a risk, surely, that this could lead in time to a geopolitical impasse where competing blocs just paralyze any kind of global consensus.
Yes, definitely. Interestingly, Jeremy, I was at a conference last year hosted by Mistra, and it was about what is called the Thucydides trap. It's a theory in international relations that when a major hegemonic power is in decline and there is a rapid rise of an emerging power, let's say China, that there is what is called the Thucydides trap. And that means that invariably there will be flashpoints or conflicts. And we're beginning to see these conflicts emerge. And the Trump 2.0 trade wars is an example of the global system fracturing and falling into these traps that is leading to economic conflict, technological rivalry, as we see. But unfortunately, this theory also says there may be military conflicts. Hopefully not. And we hope the global system is robust enough and global governance is strong enough to prevent a global conflict between superpowers.
So as we come to the end of the conversation, maybe it's important to bring it back home. And critical to all of this is how South Africa might define success at the G20 summit, not only as a host, but also as a strategic player. What's your thinking on that?
Yes, I've attended several G20 seminars and events over the weeks, and there is a sobering reality that the US is not committed. And I think there's too much focus on the communique. What would the final G20 communique be like? And I think if we were to look at the Brics Rio communique of 2 weeks ago, it's quite remarkable and quite progressive. In fact, if you read the Brics communique, it's definitely committed to saving the UN, to promoting multilateralism, global economic governance. And I think the G20 can take a leaf out of there, build on that. For me, the three big wins would definitely be the G20 common framework on finance and debt. And therein, the big items are to agree on a cost of capital, to reduce the cost of capital, to address the African debt crisis. And then the third one would be climate finance. And I think if we manage to get agreements on those key areas, at least there's a working agenda for G20 nations going forward.
And if you to look at those priorities, what is going to be important if we had this conversation a year after the summit? What's top of the priority list?
I would definitely say international financial reform, significant reforms, as well as saving multilateral institutions, especially a fair trade deal at the WTO. But the real politic being The US is hosting the G20 in 2026, and the Trump administration are not committed to the South African agenda and priorities. And therefore, you are going to get a rupture. And, it's very difficult to predict with the Trump administration. He may downgrade the G20 as he's committed to and focus purely on the leadership summit as well as just the finance track. And the US is only interested in the finance track because it needs global financial inflows into its economy to sustain their national debt. So that's the only track that they're interested in, again, from a national interest point of view. So it's going to be very difficult, I think, for South Africa. Saving grace would be to get some commitment to get the WTO working again, as well as international financial reform and some kind of debt deal for Africa. If we get a debt deal for Africa, that would be a big plus.
Ashraf Patel, Senior Research Associate at the Institute for Global Dialogue at UNISA. Thank you very much indeed for those insights and also for your refreshing candor. Let me try and sum this up. What is clear is that we're standing at the edge of a geopolitical inflection point where old alignments are shifting and new alliances are still being shaped in real time. That is pretty obvious. The convergence, as we've been discussing, of Brics and the G20 might, as Ashraf suggests, signal the dawn of a more inclusive global order, or it may expose just how fractured that ambition really is. Either way, the choices made in Johannesburg are going to ripple far beyond the summit itself. For South Africa, the challenge is immense, but so is the opportunity to act not only as a host, but to act maybe as a hinge, to bridge the divides that we've been talking about, define the narrative, and maybe help design a future where voice equals influence. That's it for this episode of Mandates and Megaphones, brought to you by Standard Bank here on Moneyweb. I'm Jeremy Maggs, and join us next time as we continue to follow the mandates, the megaphones, and the moments that are going to shape South Africa's place in the world. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for listening to Mandates and Megaphones. You can find more episodes on moneyweb.co.za.